What is the first thing a tyrant does when he comes to power? He doesn't take away your guns. He doesn't empty your bank account. He doesn't put you in prison, although all of those things could come later down the line. The first thing a tyrant does is he takes your words. He restricts your ability to express yourself. Because if you can control what people say, you can control the culture, you can control the climate, you can control the social conscience. And if you can control these things, you can engineer a society in which your tyranny can continue without much resistance. He controls what can be said, what can be written, what can be thought, what can be published. And he also controls the boundaries of acceptable opinion. All of these are infractions on freedom of speech. And once those boundaries are set, once the population has been trained to police its own speech, everything else follows naturally. All the other mechanisms of enforcement of tyranny are coming down the line once the population has been trained to police its own speech. And this is not ancient history. You can observe this in the 20th century, in the 19th century, even as late as the 18th century. But this is happening before our very eyes today in the West, across the world. Censorship, the encroachment on free speech, and you have an entire contingent of society that is arguing that free speech is actually not an important right, that you don't actually need free speech, that there's hate speech laws that need to be enforced, there's misinformation and disinformation on the internet, and the altruistic, almighty hand of the government has to come and dispel the disinformation and misinformation, which a lot of the times is just information that challenges the paradigms of the average person or information that they disagree with. But you have an entire contingent of people that actually believe that free speech is not necessary. So I'm here to make the case as to why it is absolutely necessary, and without it, you cannot have a functioning society. Free speech is not merely a legal right, ladies and gentlemen. Free speech is the foundation upon which all other rights rest. It is the bedrock of a free society. It is the cornerstone of what it takes to live in a free civilization. Free speech is the conduit to freedom. There's the reason why the free speech is the First Amendment in the United States Constitution, not the second, not the fifth, the first. The founders of the United States understood something that we are in danger of forgetting. All other freedoms depend on the freedom to speak. Freedom of religion means nothing if you can't speak about your faith. Freedom of the press means nothing if you can't publish the opinions that you truly hold and believe. Freedom of speech is not one freedom among many. It is the oxygen that all other freedoms breathe. Think of it this way. In society, there are those in power and those not in power. Those in power have every incentive to silence the powerless, because if they silence the powerless, they can continue to propagate their power. Those in power have every incentive to remove all forms of accountability, and one of the easiest ways to remove a form of accountability is to prevent people from talking about your wrongdoings, right? And one of the easiest ways to you can do this without resorting to violence, because a lot of the times throughout history, tyranny has to come violently, is to just restrict what people can say. If people can't point out your flaws, if people can't talk about the problem, then all of a sudden, your tyranny can continue unabetted and aided by people's complicity. Noam Chomsky once said, a man of the left, let it be noted, but Noam Chomsky once said that the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Think about how profound a quote that is. The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow lively debate within that spectrum. Let's say you and I, you the viewer, you and I share a house. And in our house, the showers don't work upstairs. We have a room on the main floor where we keep all of our money and all of our precious belongings, and someone's breaking the window and stealing, right? The alarm system doesn't work. There's no heating. And meanwhile, you and I are only allowed to talk about the family room and the color of the walls on the family room. You want a blue wall, I want a yellow wall, and we're just fighting blue and yellow, blue and yellow. We're debating, we're talking about how blue will allow for a more calmer environment, how yellow is my favorite color, and because I paid for the house, I think it should be yellow. We're having all these, interesting, thought-provoking, sophisticated conversations about the family room, but we've left out the bigger picture of the house, the fact that the showers don't work upstairs, the fact that, people are burglaring the house, the fact that, the heat doesn't work. There's all these other issues. And so one of the easiest ways free speech is eroded is by limiting the spectrum of acceptable opinion. That isn't freedom. It's a cage with a very long chain. It's like a fishbowl, right? Imagine yourself swimming in a fishbowl. The moment you try and swim out of the fishbowl, the fish thinks it's an open water. It thinks it's an ocean. But the moment it tries to swim past the fishbowl, it realizes that its freedom, its mobility is actually very limited. It's the same thing with free speech. Truth is not a fixed state, ladies and gentlemen. Truth is discovered, it is argued, it is contested, it is theorized, and then it is proven, and then it is corroborated, and then it is disproven sometimes. Truth is not a fixed state. There was a scientist, the name escapes me at the moment. There was a scientist in the 1800s who came out with the hypothesis that if everyone washes their hands after they go to the washroom and everyone washes their hands before they eat, you would reduce the number of disease, you would reduce the number of germs, and you would have a healthier population that would live longer. He theorized that. That was quickly labeled as misinformation and disinformation, whatever those terms were back in the day. He was pretty much called a lunatic, and he was prevented from publishing his opinion. And 50 years later, another scientist discovered the exact same thing, that yes, if people did wash their hands after they use the toilet and before they eat, you would reduce the number of diseases, germs by a significant margin. And that is one of the most effective ways to be healthy and to create a healthy population, is to wash your hands regularly. And so the truth is not a fixed state. This idea that we can censor free speech rests on the idea that we have discovered the truth, and we have not. We don't know the truth about anything. Anything you consider to be the truth could be contested, it could be disproven, it could be, adjusted in some mechanism. If an idea is false, defeat it. Don't bury it. Burying it doesn't kill the idea. It just lets it fester underground. Another problem with free speech, or censoring free speech, is the echo chamber problem. Free speech acts as a societal pressure release valve. You get to know what the population is thinking. If you restrict free speech, then you have certain groups that fester in echo chambers. You want these groups out in the open. You want them to say what they think. Let them say what they think. Otherwise, they're just going to fester in echo chambers. Another huge problem of censorship, or any restrictions on free speech whatsoever, is who decides. We arrive at the most fundamental and most overlooked problem with censorship, the who decides problem. Every censorship regime requires a censor. Someone who has to determine what is true, what is false, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, what is harmful, what is legitimate dissent, and what is dangerous extremism. And then you encounter the unavoidable subjectivity of the person deciding. If the person deciding is a religious fundamentalist, any attacks on religion are going to be considered dangerous extremism. Any attacks on spirituality or mockery, anything opposite of that, is going to be considered perfectly acceptable, even if that's more radical than the religion itself. Right? And vice versa. If you have someone who's completely opposed to religion, they think religion is just a way to control the masses, then they're going to be fine with all forms of degeneracy that is not religious, but anything religious might be labeled a dangerous extremist, a Christian nationalist, someone that has to be censored. You inevitably encounter the unavoidable subjectivity of the person in charge, or the person doing the censoring. There is only power, and power decides in favor of power. If you have someone in charge who believes a certain worldview, he's going to assign a censor, someone to decide what is information, misinformation, and disinformation, who aligns with his worldview. And that's where you get to a place where you can't criticize the mechanisms of your own financial exploitation. You can't question usury. You can't question how debt is used as a control mechanism. There's all these things that can just be completely eroded by having a censor that only allows you to talk about a certain, sphere. The political weaponization of free speech is not a slippery slope fallacy, it's a guarantee. If the government can't define misinformation, then misinformation can be anything. The more vague the laws, the more oppressive the state. Think about that. The more vague the laws, the more oppressive the state. And misinformation is a very vague term. Right? And I already talked about the social pressure release valve. The last thing I'll say is that people in the West have gotten so soft, and the peace of the fool is worth more than the clarity of the wise. Dostoevsky once said, a man who was sentenced to death, led to the execution ground, and reprieved at the last moment as a deliberate act of psychological torture by, his government. A man who wrote some famous novels, great novels. Dostoevsky once said, thinking will be outlawed so as not to offend the fool. And that's where we've gotten to in the West. We're not just physically soft, we're often soft in mentality, right? Weak words, we're so weak that words on a screen are perceived as a threat. Think about that. You have no problems. You can go to the supermarket and buy anything you want. You have electricity, you have heat, you have, everything is provided for you. But words on a screen are dangerous. That's how soft we've gotten in certain parts of the world. The antidote to a bad idea is not to shield people from the idea, it's to produce a better idea, right? A society that cannot tolerate challenge and cannot let challenge grow is a society that cannot grow itself. People that cannot sit with an uncomfortable argument cannot think, period, right? And the last thing I'll say is opinions are not misinformation. Opinions you disagree with aren't misinformation. Ideas that threaten your paradigm are not disinformation. They are, in many cases, the truth, right? The word misinformation has become one of the most abused words in the cultural zeitgeist over the last few years. Any opinion that you don't disagree with, any historical context given that doesn't prove your point or doesn't prove the government's point is now misinformation. If someone makes a claim that you believe is false, the honest response is to demonstrate why it's false. Cite evidence, make an argument, make an honest argument, right? The moment instead you reach for the label misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, dangerous, you've admitted implicitly that you cannot counter the point. You admitted implicitly that you cannot win the argument. This is intellectual cowardice disguised as moral virtue. And that's what a lot of people who want to censor free speech are. They're cowards and they disguise themselves with morality and virtue so that they can censor people who disagree with them, only to allow opinions that they agree with take hold and continue on in the mainstream.